So in the last video, I introduced creating and calling functions. Now in this one, I just want to go through arguments. Now arguments are things that you can create between these parentheses here and use within your function. You'll sometimes hear these referred to as parameters as well. So what I'm going to do is go through the most common, which are positional and keyword arguments in this video. So at the minute, this doesn't do a huge amount. And it's not very adaptable based on different parts of my code. It's doing the same thing every time I call it, which is just saying welcome from a function. So we'll keep it simple, but we're going to introduce some variables here. So we're going to have name and age. So what we can do is we can then use the skills you've learned before. So we could format our string and introduce these variables within it. So these are variables that are effectively going to be passed when the function's called. So I'm going to say welcome name, and then I'll do, just wrap the text. You are age, years old. I'll put from a function. So we can still see it's running within the function. So it's still not very complicated. I'm trying to keep it simple for now. You'll see how we'll make these functions more complicated later. But we've got a message now that is a little bit more adaptable depending on what these two variables are. So now when I call my function down here, it's going to error. So if I press run, look at errors, and it's saying welcome message is missing 2 required positional arguments. So what that means is up here, it said when this function runs, it's going to have one thing passed here and another thing passed there, which are going to be used within the function. So all I need to do is I need to just type 2 things in here. So just like, you know, when you do a print and you put in something in the brackets, this is the same. So I'm going to say Bob and 44. And when I run it, it says, welcome Bob, you are 44 years old from a function. So it's used this in here. Now, it's worth knowing that this has now made our function a little bit better because we can use it more than once. So I can say Steve, who is 12. And now you can see the function is ran, but we've passed it different data. Okay, so this is becoming more useful. And these are known as positional arguments because based on the position when they're passed through, that is how they're used. So Bob becomes name and 44 becomes age. Obviously, if I did this the wrong way round, so I'll have 44 at the start and then Bob, because these are positional arguments, that's going to suddenly break, isn't it? Because it says now, welcome 44, you are Bob years old, which makes no sense at all. So another option, positional arguments is probably the most common. And when you're programming, you just need to make sure you pass the right data in the right position. The other option is when you actually call the function, you can actually say which one is which. So I could say age is 44 and name is Bob. And then even though I passed them in the wrong order, it's assigning them to the relevant variable at call time. So I'm basically saying when I call it, 44 becomes age, Bob becomes name, and then when it gets passed up here, it's all working okay. So now this works quite well, but let's do a different example. So let's do welcome area calc. So I'm going to make a little function to calculate the area of, let's say, a shape. Okay, so what we're going to say, we're going to have width, height, and depth. And then we're going to print out width times height times depth. So now when we call this area calc, we're going to pass it 3 numbers. we're just using positional arguments, and it outputs 6. Now, what you can do is we can actually have what we call default arguments as well. So up here, because we've just used simple positions there, obviously we could do things like mix it up. So we could have height equals the 3, width equals 2, and depth equals 1. Let's go for 9. Let's make it a bigger number. And then it swapped them round when it's been called. So depth becomes 9. It obviously might affect the mathematics here, although in this case it's not so much. What I would suggest doing though is understanding what we call default arguments. So up at the top here, if I go back, keep this simple. Up at the top here, what we can do is we can assign values so that nothing breaks. So for example here, if I call area calc 9 and 2, it's going to error because it says missing one required positional argument, depth, because I've only passed it a width and a height. Now you can set a default by writing equals 1, and that means if something isn't passed to it, then it's going to equal 1. So let's keep this really simple. Look, so 2 and 2. So 2 times 2 is 4, times 1 is still 4. So when I run this, it equals 4, look. So by having default arguments, it means you can stop your program breaking, or you can change the way it's used. So in our example here, it's calculated the area of a 2D square, 2 by 2, I assume they're centimeters or whatever. But by making this default to 1, this can work to calculate the area of something 2D, or we could throw in the depth for 3D as well. So we've got one function that does 2 jobs. So if I change this to 10, so we now should have 2 by 2 equal 4 times 10 equals 40. And you can see it's now took on 10 as the depth, not 1, because I've passed it something. 1 is the default argument if I didn't pass it anything. So that's arguments, and hopefully I've explained positional arguments and keyword arguments.